Romeo 1, we've gained a 60-minute window on the primary target. You have multiple cell units moving on your position. Do not jeopardize the goddamn mission now.
If this generation has been anything, it has surely been one of trilogies. From Mass Effect to Uncharted and recently Dead Space, we've seen several series both introduced and then brought to their narrative conclusions on just a single set of platforms. And as we watch the sun set on a current generation of hardware, so too does another popular blockbuster series meet its own end. We're talking, of course, of EA's Crysis 3, the latest science fiction shooter from the technical wizards at Crytek, which continues and concludes their story of nanosuit warriors and alien invasions. To ensure we give this game maximum coverage, joining me in this review is Rocket Chainsaw editor Anthony Capone, from whom science fiction shooters with stealth possibilities is surely ticking quite a few boxes.
Oh, you know you know me too well, Jarrod.
I know far too well. So, where do you sit with Crysis 3?
Well, just to give you some context, I have not played Crysis 1 on PC. I played Crysis 2 on Xbox 360. It's up there with one of my favourite games of this generation.
Crysis 2 was your entry point into the series.
I have gone back and purchased number 1 on Xbox, but only a few hours into that one. So, yeah, I'm a console Crysis player through and through.
I started with the original Crysis way back when it was first released on PC. I also went through the Warhead expansion pack. And then, I picked up Crysis 2 the day it came out, quite enjoyed it. And just like you, also picked up Crysis 3. So you've been playing on Xbox, I've been playing on PC. We've both been getting very similar experiences, though. So how did you feel about Crysis 3?
Overall, I thought it was a very polished, very fun, very capable game, but looking back on Crysis 2, it just lacked that X factor that made the second game one of the best games.
Tighter control experience. Yeah. I suppose the interesting thing for me with Crysis 3 is that it almost... Crytek got a lot of complaints from fans when they made Crysis 2. You know, the fans were complaining the levels were too closed, too linear. So for me, it feels like they've gone back to Crysis 1's level design, so it's more open. But they've also tried to rope in the diversity of enemies of Crysis 2 and the tighter design, and I'm not entirely sure that was the right decision.
I actually rather enjoyed that linear aspect of Crysis 2, the set-piece driven journey from point A to point D, and how the boss fights were very deliberate.
It worked very well within the context of what it was trying to do.
And I can see how with Crysis 3 they're trying to go back to the roots, so to speak, and open up the world for the original players. And I think it's definitely entertaining, but it's just somewhat lacking.
Yeah, for me, having these great big environments, it was really obvious that they didn't seem to be populated with enough opponents. Yeah. Did you find that?
As you mentioned, the maps are quite large. But going in, you would only have maybe a dozen or so enemies, and it doesn't seem proportionate to the amount of environment that you're playing in. Whereas in number 2, like you maybe had a corridor, a city square, and you had a dozen enemies to contend with. It was a very tight experience, and it actually felt populated. But here, because the areas are so large, it's rather disproportionate.
Yeah, and it worked well enough in Crysis 1 because in any one encounter against the human enemies, you would also have the possibility of running into, say, a jeep, or boats, or helicopters, or tanks, or trucks. So you weren't just fighting snipers and shotgun enemies and rocket launchers. You had a good diversity of vehicles as well, which really opened up the freeform large environments. With Crysis 3, you've got these... They're impressively large, quite surprising. Like, you moving from A to B, you traverse quite a large amount of terrain. But it's populated with mostly just human opponents.
The Cell Goons.
The Cell Goons, which are thinly covering the environment, and...
It's just pockets of resistance here and there, and it doesn't give you that sense of immersion that number 2 did.
Yeah, and I think the lack of diversity in the enemies really opened up how cheap the gameplay can feel at times, especially with the weapons.
Yep.
In Crysis 1, you felt like you needed to use all your abilities and the weapons at your disposal. In Crysis 2, because it was so tightly designed and so action-heavy...
You could either use your armor or your stealth, and you're pretty much guaranteed a favourable outcome.
Exactly, whereas in Crysis 3, they introduced the bow concept, and I'm fairly certain you can cheese your way through the entire
Yeah,
game by
don't get me wrong.
counting arrows.
The bow is a fantastic weapon. I like how you're given several varieties. Like you've got the one that you can shoot into water and
Yep.
electrocute enemies. The one with the explosion. But at the end of the day, as fun as it is to use, it is a weapon that you can get through the entire game without much trouble at all.
Did you play stealth or did you play action?
I'm always the kind of player who will default to stealth, and if things go pear-shaped, I'll open up guns blazing. So I did play the majority of the game stealth, and when things got heavy-handed, I grabbed my guns and went from there.
I actually found that a little bit problematic with the Ceph as well, the Aliens Return. And in Crysis 2, they were very mobile. I felt they were really fun to fight because they were jumping up.
They're always very agile and flanking
Very
you.
agile.
They actually gave you a pretty hard time.
Yeah, they seem to pursue you and jump up on all these environments and really try and hunt you down. Whereas in Crysis 3, I almost felt like they stood there and walked at you and just kept shooting directly.
Yeah,
into your face.
There is one level where you're on a platform overlooking a massive area. And I remember when I started that level, I just sat there for 5 minutes just sniping all the enemies, and then I pretty much had free reign to go through and do what I wanted to, unhindered.
I'm pretty certain I know exactly which level you're talking about, and I did the exact same thing. And that was also a really open level, and you sort of had that feeling of, that there were a lot of ways you could approach this. And I suppose that's, where the game balance comes into question.
Yeah.
In Crysis 1, because of the enemy damage values and the enemy diversity in vehicles, even if you tried to go stealth and range, there was a pressure that if you messed up, you would be in a lot of trouble.
Yep.
In Crysis 3,
you can just kind of stealth, go away and come back and everything will be okay.
Yeah, I also think a lot of the encounters could probably be stealth by entirely.
Yeah.
The dam especially, I mean, if you hit cloak and run from cover to cover, wait for the quick recharge and keep going, there's not a lot of pressure on you to even engage in the enemy. It seems like there hasn't been this synergy between the game mechanics and the shooting and the level design. It's like they've got all these ideas and just kind of...
They just don't gel together as well as they could.
They don't gel together well at all. Did you like the story at all, the way it was driving you through the missions?
Ironically, I think Crysis 3 had the best presented story of any Crysis game. I actually knew what was going on, I knew who the characters were, and I really enjoyed the interaction between Prophet and Psycho. I knew what was going on for the majority of the game, and it actually ended pretty clearly, whereas number 2, you really had no clue who was who and what was happening.
I really liked the voice acting as well.
Yeah.
I thought Psycho. All the characters actually were... The script was really well written. The characters seemed like they had... Yeah, well, for a Crysis game. They seemed like they had a really strong personality. Their voice actors did an incredible job of delivering their performances. I didn't mind the story. To me, it kind of fumbled a bit. The whole Alpha Ceph concept, which is the main hook that's introduced very early on, was just kind of like, oh, and suddenly there's an Alpha Ceph.
It's the oddest looking Ceph
I've ever seen. Weird. Yeah.
Just three drill bits on the end of a tail. Spoiler alert.
I thought I was expecting something a bit more sinister and intimidating. And every single Crysis game feels almost a little bit disconnected from the last ones. It almost feels like they're writing 3 different stories.
But with this one, they did go back to the characters from the original game, and I thought, and tried to tie it up nicely.
It was really great to see Psycho, who was also in the Warhead expansion pack. He was the protagonist of that one. So, I mean, Prophet and Psycho are the 2 characters that have been in more games than any of them. And
but is it Prophet?
Prophet.
But is it really Prophet?
It is Prophet. I mean, kind of.
Maybe.
It's ridiculous. Did you think there was a drive to go through the levels? I mean, the plot was there, but...
It was there and it was sufficient, but I think one of the main... What could have helped the story was that the game was so short. They didn't really have that much plot to write. It was only... My playthrough took me 7 hours, and I was playing on Veteran. I did all the secondary mission objectives, and I found most of the collectibles. Whereas Crysis 2, it felt like an encyclopedia, with each chapter having a defined objective or something that happened. It felt like a really good, say, 20-chapter book. Whereas Crysis 3, you're there, you kind of go battle some dudes, and then it's finished.
Yeah,
and like,
I felt pretty similar. I mean, I thought the level diversity, the location diversity was really good, but there wasn't a very good connection between them and where I'm going and what I'm doing. Yeah, Crysis 2 had a really nice flow to it. Yeah, like you said, it felt like a nicely chaptered book.
Yeah.
You know, it had a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah.
And you moved from set piece
Whereas
to set
this one,
piece.
it's almost like you blink and it's over.
Yeah, you just kind of, well, here's a level, here's some Ceph, here's some cell units, you know, make your way to the top of the dam.
And that
do
was
this,
really
do
good
that.
because, I mean, I appreciate how, going back to what we were saying earlier, like at the start you can, using your visor, pick out all your enemies and then
Yeah,
choose your strategy. Like, as we were saying, you can choose stealth or
yeah.
go in
the
guns blazing.
hardcore
And
action kind of thing.
the semi-sandbox style of what they've done, but yeah, as we were saying, given the amount of enemies, it just doesn't gel as well as it could have because
Yeah,
there's
it just doesn't...
the level design and the enemies are in conflict with each other.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, I think, you know, to me it was when it's at its best, when you have those brief moments of really exciting gameplay and all the pieces come together.
Like the,
It was really-
for example, the dam level and when you escape that was a really cool.
The dam level was
scenario.
excellent. That was probably one of the better levels in the game.
I probably enjoyed that one along with the grassland level where you're going through shooting the towers.
The grassland level
Most,
was
yeah.
cool as well. And those levels had a really good sense of progression.
Yeah.
And I suppose diversity. You know, you'd start one place and then you'd end up somewhere else and somewhere else, all just part of one level. And it almost felt like it was mixing up. The
Like
playstyle.
there was a defined objective, and even though you could choose how to approach it, there was like a definitive thing you had to accomplish. Whereas I felt like a lot of the other levels were almost bland and generic. I mean, it facilitated the gameplay well enough, but for example, the level where you're just kind of stealthing around all of these wrecked buildings, it didn't really
Yeah.
engage me or say, you know, this is a Crysis game. It just felt very general.
Those were the levels that, to me, felt like they were trying to call really heavily upon the design of Crysis 1. Those levels were probably the biggest levels in the game in terms of, you know, environment size that you can traverse, but that's when the issues of enemy variety and how populated these maps are really started to expose themselves. There's a level in the first Crysis game, I think it's Onslaught, where, you know, there's this huge field, so it's massive environment to fight on, but it's massively populated with tanks and helicopters and all kinds of things. Whereas in this one, you know, you have this huge terrain, but you almost find yourself like Skyrim style, trekking it from A to B really slowly.
With not much in between.
Yeah, not much in between. Just like, oh yeah, the environment's big, but there's not a lot to do in it.
Yeah, and I don't think they utilize the Ceph enough. They're a really interesting enemy.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Didn't really
they probably
feel
could have mixed up more Ceph and human conflict as well. There's a couple of levels in Crysis 2 where the humans and the Ceph went head to head.
Yeah, I really enjoyed those. And for example, the level in Crysis 2 where you're in Central Station and you have to defeat the large Ceph. Like Crysis 3 didn't really have any of those moments for me.
No, I would agree. It just felt empty. And
there
like
was
it
one
didn't come
boss
together.
fight, and I mean that was cool, but it felt kind of silly at the same time.
Do you mean the end boss?
Not the end boss, maybe the boss before the end boss.
Okay. Yeah, I actually didn't like that boss much at all. It sort of felt a bit really artificial how it confined you to a single area. And
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, in some ways, you know, the game I suppose felt almost expansion packy to Crysis 2, but
Yeah.
a little bit
It was
misdirected.
almost like the warhead of number 2. If we could use that
Agreed.
analogy.
In terms of presentation, Crytek have made a really big deal out of this game.
Yep.
Especially since it's powered by, I think it's CryEngine 3.5.
CryEngine 3.5.
Yeah, they've been talking on PC. They've been talking about how it's next gen ready. They've been talking about how this engine is ready for the kind of graphical capabilities and presentation capabilities.
And I
we're
understand
gonna
that on
be seeing.
PC it looks marvellous.
It looks absolutely stunning. They've completely delivered on that promise.
And they've also included all the options that they removed from Crysis 2.
Yeah, well, with Crysis 2 was an excellent looking game when it came out, but it's relative to the era. When Crysis 1 came out, it was literally doing things that no other game was doing, so for its time, it was way ahead. As good as Crysis 2 looked, it wasn't really doing anything beyond its time. It was just a really nice looking game. Crysis 3 has gone back to the Crysis 1 concept and made an engine and assets and content that is far and away beyond anything else pretty much on PC.
Would you go as far to say it is the prettiest looking PC game?
In terms of technical, probably it's using a global illumination render for all the environments, so the lighting engine is absolutely incredible. It's also extremely demanding. My poor GTX 570.
That terminology means nothing to me.
It's my graphics card, and it copped quite a beating. The game seemed pretty
coming
scalable.
from Mr. Technological himself.
Yeah, well, yeah. They've also made a big deal about it on consoles as well. Crytek have said that this game is, pushing consoles to the breaking point. This is 100% of their capabilities. Did you think that on the Xbox 360?
I don't think they could have squeezed much more from what they got from the console engine. It looks like an extra polish is being added to what, for example, we saw in Crysis 2. It looks great, but I personally think that titles like Halo 4 and Uncharted 3 do have the edge. It's a very nice looking military shooter, but obviously you can see the shortcomings compared to what you can see on PC.
It's hard to talk about like the frame rate on PC because it really is dependent on the hardware you've got and the settings you select. If I max it out on PC on my card, I get maybe average of 30 frames.
I can say I got a very stable experience on console.
So yeah, I heard that Crysis 2 was a little bit choppy on the Xbox.
It was in times. Crysis 3 it is very smooth.
So they've upped the frame rate.
Yeah,
well, that's a good.
It's a very stable game.
What do you think of the soundtrack?
Excellent. I know Hans Zimmer composed the theme of number 2, and while he wasn't present on this one, still thought it had an excellent soundtrack with a number of tracks that very very rememberable.
I didn't find many of the in-game tracks memorable, but I thought the theme was very memorable.
Yeah, the menu.
It's got a strange sound to it that really sticks in your head, and it's quite good. All the audio production for the actual environments,
absolutely,
and the weapon sounds were all really really good.
Yeah,
Crytek
I think
sound engineers
we should shout out for what the game does for weapons, just being able to customize them on the fly. Just the weight and feel of each weapon feels different.
Yeah, that feels really good. It seemed a bit more diverse than Crysis 2 as well. You had all the different ammunition types. There seemed to be a bit more scope attachments and underbarrel attachments. And the fact that you can just press a button
and it happens instantly is great.
Yeah, like just stick a night vision scope on a rifle and change the ammunition type to explosive, and it feels really nice.
Just on the subject of weapons, what did you think of to go on a little from there, what did you think of the vehicle segments?
Forgettable.
Yeah.
To me, that was trying to go back because Crysis 1 had a lot of vehicle segments, but 99% of them were completely optional because the vehicles were just in the map. I mean, you could literally hijack a vehicle from an enemy, kill the driver, kill the gunner, take his vehicle.
Yep.
So vehicles offered a concept of enemy and also tool. In here, to me, the vehicles almost felt like, and now you're driving a vehicle, that token vehicle mission. And I didn't think they were all that exciting. I didn't think they were all that well implemented. They seemed a bit artificial, again, trying to call back to Crysis 1, but not doing it the way Crysis 1 did it. Did you like them?
I'm completely neutral. I don't think they added anything, but at the same time, I wouldn't go as far to say I hated them.
There.
Yeah. But one thing I did get to hate very fast was the hacking minigame.
Yeah, that was weird. It's like they've caught upon like the Mass Effect or something. We got to put in that timing-based minigame.
I appreciated what it would do, how it would maybe turn a turret to your side or disarm a mine, but how they implemented that mechanic was very boring.
I suppose that's true for the suit system as well.
I mean,
you've got this customizable suit where you unlock different powers and you can customize, whether you want to be really good at cloaking or really fast. And
but by the time you get around to doing anything, the game's over.
Exactly.
You don't need to do anything.
It's like trying to stick a role-playing stat system in a fairly linear and short first-person shooter. And I was like, I don't really need to upgrade my stealth or my strength. I'll just use them in the game when I feel I need to use them anyway, and they'll work fine enough.
Yeah. How long did it take you to? I know I said it took me about 7 hours. How long did you?
I honestly can't remember. It would have been probably about 7 or 8 hours.
Yep.
I can't remember what difficulty. It wasn't the lowest, that's for sure.
Yep.
At first I thought it was short, but I also feel the levels, each individual level lasted longer than an individual level in Crysis 2.
Yep.
The total runtime was probably a bit shorter than Crysis 2. But yeah, each level lasted a bit longer. I think the level count in this is 7 or 8 or something like that.
And Crysis 7 levels.
Yeah, Crysis 2 is something like 14.
They took me about an hour each.
Yeah, probably about the same. I mean, it really depends on the playstyle you're going for, the difficulty. I don't think there's a lot of incentive to replay unless you really enjoy the game.
Yeah.
And just want to unlock everything. I mean, the replay really is if you're going to dig into the multiplayer.
Yep.
We've both given it a shot.
Yeah.
We both played the beta as well. It's if you played the beta, it's really, really similar. It's pretty much the same thing. I'm actually quite fond of it.
Yeah, look, I could see they've definitely put the effort in, and they've tried to make a serious multiplayer. In the long run, I don't really see it competing with Call of Duty or Battlefield, but I think it'll get a pretty small and loyal following, and it's great for what it is.
Yeah, I think like the whole Call of Duty style stat system to unlock superpowers and upgrade your weapons. I don't know if that's I don't know if that fits very well into this kind of game. I sort of wish it was a bit more to the point and faster, because that's where the game's at its strength. I really like this idea of being able to cloak and strength on the fly.
Yep.
The game certainly has a very different feel to your mainstays on other genres. I really liked Hunter mode, especially where...
Oh, that can be so tense when you hear the footsteps
so
of the nanosuit players.
Yeah, it's a really
approaching
basic concept, but it also, it doesn't feel like Call of Duty. It doesn't feel like Battlefield. It's really where the game comes into its own.
Yeah,
you have these soldiers
just for the listeners, there's a mode where you have two players starting off as the nanosuit wearers and 10 or 12
pretty much everybody else.
And the nanosuit wearers are permanently cloaked. They have a bow and arrow, and for every kill they get, they turn the cell member into another suit-wearing hunter.
Yeah, it's truly survival. I mean, you
can't see them, but you can only hear the sound of their footsteps approaching, and maybe a glimmer of a silhouette.
Their cloaking device slightly shimmers.
Yeah.
But that's a completely unique gameplay style.
I think at the end of the day, it does turn into a bit of a camping fest, though. Everyone just hiding in a corner.
With the camping, I was actually pretty good on that. So
well, maybe it's because I come from the console population.
Maybe, maybe. It felt very similar to Crysis. I put a little bit of time into Crysis 2's multiplayer. It feels pretty similar.
Yeah, it's made by the Free Radical.
Say again, sorry?
The Crytek UK.
Yeah, it was made by the Free Radical dudes.
Yeah.
And, I think they got their head around how to make a multiplayer fun. There seems to be enough maps. The game modes are fun enough.
It's not
balanced.
A throwaway multiplayer. It's a serious chunk of the game, and it's well made.
Yeah, for sure. I think if you're a fan of that nanosuit style gameplay, the multiplayer actually will have staying power, probably longer than the campaign. And if you liked Crysis 2's multiplayer, then all the more reason to actually try out Crysis 3's multiplayer.
Yeah.
So I suppose coming to a conclusion, out of the 3 Crysis games that you've played, where would you position Crysis 2?
Well, until I finish number 1, I think Crysis 2 is still my favourite. I really enjoyed 2 for its length, its enemy encounters, and the sense of urgency it gave you. Like, even though it was linear, you always had a purpose, and in New York, battling the Ceph, you always had a sense of purpose, but just being in the new setting, it doesn't really have that same illusion, and it just doesn't feel as defined. It doesn't have the same epicness or intensity as number 2 for me personally. It just doesn't feel like it has that same set piece campaign that I really enjoy. At the same time, though, it's still a very capable game, very entertaining. I can definitely see the players of Crysis 1 appreciating it. So, look, it's a fun game. I'm glad I played it, but yeah, just not up there with number 2 for me.
Yeah, for me it's very similar. The first game's probably my favourite. I still really enjoyed Crysis 2, even though I do think it was a step backwards in a lot of areas. To me, they're both very different games that did their own thing and did their own thing well enough. Crysis 3 feels a bit like it's trying to find an in-between between Crysis 1 and Crysis 2. It takes good elements of both, but at the same time I don't think they blend together as well as Crytek probably hoped. I think it's good framework maybe for Crysis 4 to build on that.
Oh god,
really
think of the storyline ramifications.
I don't even want to think of the storyline ramifications. And I really like, going back to the open level design. Purely on a technological front, Crytek completely delivered their promises of making a next generation game.
It's a very solid, entertaining shooter that just doesn't quite gel as well as it could.
So what scores would you give it?
in the range of 7 to 8. Probably, I'd stamp it with a 7.
Yeah, for me it's quite similar. I'd probably lean more towards an optimistic 6 or, a kind of comfortable 7. I think there's plenty of value in the product in terms of quality, production, and how much fun you can have. I think it's probably the most misguided of the 3 games, 3 main games.
We are very, Jarrod, you and myself are a very tough crowd to please.
We are a very tough crowd to please. Multiplayer definitely raises the value of the product quite high, simply because I think it's really well rounded and doesn't feel like a throwaway feature. So 6 to 7, but I'd probably give it a 7.
So the Rocket Chainsaw seal of approval with a score of 7.
We give Crysis 3 a 7.
Which is, on the Rocket Chainsaw scale, is well above average. A very entertaining, very good game.
Yep. Okay, well, thanks, listeners, for reading. For more news and reviews, please visit www.rocketchainsaw.com.au.
I prophesize that it will be a fantastic website.
That was wonderful.
Back! Get back! Whatever they found, it's dead now.